Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us for this exciting roundtable discussion, Solving for XDR, Modernizing Security Operations with SentinelOne and Zscaler. Without further ado, I'll pass the ball to the moderator of today's discussion, Michael Leland, Chief Security Evangelist at SentinelOne.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you to all who are attending. This is an exciting topic for me. I've been handling security operations now for the better part of 20 years, having founded and built a SIM technology that was acquired by another large platform vendor, most recently in the last 9 months, helping define the XDR strategy here at SentinelOne. With us today, we have a couple of great secondary panels. We have Martin Walter, who I'll pass it off to in a moment, from Zscaler, and of course, we're excited to have John McClade from NOV. So with further ado, I will hand it off to Martin, and then we'll leave the last for John, because he'll get the first question from the panel as well. So Martin.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. First of all, Martin Walter. I'm heading up the product management team for Zscaler Internet Access, our flagship product, specifically focused on cybersecurity. I have been in the industry 25 years, not so long like security operations, but just like in the security space. Had the great privilege to work for some great companies and great technology. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm a firm believer in XDR, so can't wait to get this fireside chat started.
Great. John, how about a quick intro?
John McLeod, CISO for NOV. If you're not familiar with NOV, we're part of the energy industry. The way we kind of like to put it is we're the manufacturing arm, if you will, to the industry. We're the builders, the makers. We power the industry that powers the world.
Excellent. Somebody had commented the audio on my side was a little weak. Thumbs up if the audio is better now. Okay, fantastic. So, John, we want to start by giving the customer a chance to explain kind of his position. More importantly, give us an understanding of what NOV's cloud adoption strategy, and then from that, what your cloud security strategy has looked like over the last, say, 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, if we go back even further, I would say, back way before 24 months, we started doing a lot of research. We, meaning the IT leadership team, started doing a lot of research down this path of cloud. We kept hearing lift and shift and cloud first and all this other mess. But one thing that NOV loves doing is we like talking with our peers. What is our peers doing, and what are what is their approach? We love learning from others. And one thing that our immediate idea, I guess, that we all came up with at the same time was, we don't know if this cloud first mentality is right for NOV, is right for us. So our CIO, Alex Phillips, coined the term cloud smart. So not everything that goes in the cloud is going to be economically okay. There could be a SaaS platform that might be good, but maybe their on-prem software is best for NOV, or something like that. Or same with cloud infrastructure. Not everything is going to go into one of the cloud platforms. So I love the idea that our CIO coined as cloud smart. That's our strategy.
It's interesting because, if you had asked me 10 years ago if we would see major enterprises, specifically in power, moving their platforms to the cloud, there's a term that I used to use called, I'd ask my customers, are you nephophobia? And they'd give me that quizzical look. Nephophobia is the fear of clouds. And I had a number of customers that claimed to be nephophobic. They were absolutely not willing to consider putting data in the cloud. Most exclusively, customers in energy, nuclear specifically, if you had told me they were going to be putting their data in the cloud, I would have said, no way. Every single one of those customers that told me they would never consider cloud adoption has since moved some portion of their technology stack into the cloud. I guess that really leads down the next question is, as we start learning how to better protect cloud assets and our data in the cloud, do we think as an organization or more importantly as an industry that today's security stack meets this cloud first world? Have we gotten to the point where we're able to properly and effectively detect and mitigate threats in the cloud as well as we did on the enterprise within the protected domain of our networks. And I'll kick it off to Martin first and hear his perspective of how we're succeeding in building cloud first security stacks that work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, a little bit loaded, to be honest, as well. I think to some extent, as customers, and John, that as you move to the cloud, you also have to reconsider how you look at security, and to some extent, you also have to drive your security strategy from the cloud as well with that. What is interesting is also, I think from an industry perspective, we have been very much focused on the protect and prevent type of phases, just borrowing that from the NIST framework. But I think we also see a massive shift that is also needed more to detect and response. And that's where I think XDR really plays a major role, because at the end of the day, I think good security is really defined by how much data you have, how much visibility you have, and how can you actually use that visibility and that data and turn that into meaningful security outcomes for customers. And specifically when we look at the cloud, or the adoption of cloud, that paradigm has massively shifted, because you have your controlled environment, your network, you had all the components that would send data to a central location. But as you have all of your workforce remote, which is probably going to be, it's here to stay, working remotely, of course. You have SaaS applications everywhere, your data everywhere. So you really have to reconsider how you get access to the data and bring all the data in to drive these, use analysis, use analytics to drive these security outcomes that customers really need.
That's great, thanks. So John, your perspective on how the industry as a whole is rising to meet the challenges of cloud first or cloud smart enterprises like yourself.
Yeah, we years ago, we quickly discovered that the current security frameworks that are out there today is not going to scale in a hybrid environment. There is no way in the world you can adopt all these security controls from the different frameworks for the different hybrid environments that we're dealing with. So we elected that we're going to go down this thing called zero trust. A lot of people might boo and hiss, but I like the term. It's essentially, if you really peel the onion back, it's all about least privilege and least functionality. It's those fundamental principles that we should get back to, but it's got that sexy marketing term of zero trust. We follow the Forrester model. It's got 7 elements to it. It's very, very simple to follow. So it's not just one product or not just one element. There's different elements to it. And of course, products like Zscaler and SentinelOne make a perfect marriage into that zero trust journey for any company.
Thanks, John. So, I'll add a little bit more about what Martin said. It is really all about data, right? No more or never before have we had the volume and velocity of data being generated, and now we have to marry up the fidelity of that data to the right use case. And I come from a perspective where there have been predominantly major silos of data that have been used for data collection, whether that's EDR data going into a bespoke platform, it's SIMs consuming all third-party data that was not endpoint, and then this third one now, cloud telemetry, is a third silo that we have to marry for the right prevention, the right detection, and it's really about visibility. So let's talk more about that as we go, and we'll shift gears a little bit to XDR, right? You mentioned zero trust, and that's a really important part of protecting access to and telemetry from these different application platforms, whether they're cloud-based or marrying that with on-prem technologies. But XDR is really all about extending that detection and response capability beyond the traditional endpoint. So EDR gave us phenomenal volume and fidelity of endpoint data, but it was completely absent or divorced from other telemetry we were gathering. So as we think about security operations moving forward, and you mentioned, John, the Forrester model, depending on which analyst you listen to on the XDR talk track, it's either about consolidation and platform reduction, or additional net new detections from leveraging third-party telemetry. And of course, we all agree on the response capability, where I think both the conditional access and the XDR detections kind of come together quite effectively. As we think about this, what are the top threats that we're concerned about? And more importantly, how do we think XDR will yield better visibility that can then provide better detection that we can then parlay into better response? So let's start with Martin.
Another big question, by the way. So I think in general, when we look at the adversary landscape, I want to say we have obviously to deal with cyber criminals, and their attacks are fairly loud, and it's relatively easy to pick up and detect and prevent. I would argue, anyways. But then we also have to deal with advanced adversaries like we've seen with the SolarWinds attack. So I think at the end of the day, you have this broad spectrum of adversaries based on their abilities and capabilities, and you just have to be prepared for that they will find some way past your initial defenses, past the prevent and protect layer, if you will. And I think what is interesting there is as customers adopt the cloud, of course, we've also seen adversaries following suit, right? And they look at hey, where's your data? Essentially, if your data moves to the cloud, then they're gonna try to figure out what your cloud applications are and how can I attack them. So I think from a data perspective, from a detection response perspective, we really have to broaden our horizon a little bit. So it's not enough to just throw different capabilities in front, the adversary and rely on prevent and protect. You also have to cover your bases, of course, and figure out what gets through specific advanced adversaries. And then more importantly, how do you respond to that in a meaningful way? And I'm personally a firm believer, if I have to perform a task more than twice, I write a script. But ultimately, it comes back to adversaries use tools, right? They use software, right? And trying to respond to threats that are driven by software in a manual way, it doesn't really scale. It doesn't make sense. You're never going to be as fast as software. So automation in that whole concept around XDR is also a critical component, I believe, to really help customers not just detect, but also respond as quickly as they possibly can before an adversary can cause any damage.
I think it's a really important part when you think about the security operations perspective. Detections are great, prevention is better, but to your point, you're never going to stop everything, right? And so the new attack surface, cloud is one of the newest that we've had to face very recently. Identity is probably the other most commonly leveraged attack target, specifically because of the ability to elevate privilege and move laterally. So I think protecting that at both the access point with things like zero trust conditional access, as well as on-prem and everything else that deals with authentication and user behavioral analysis. I think those are really critical going forward from a security operations perspective, and XDR helps us marry that technology together. The important thing too is more data by itself doesn't magically yield better detections, better prevention, or better automation. But to your point, Martin, if I'm going to automate things, it's for two reasons. It's for efficiency, to make sure I can do things quickly and more quickly than I could in the past with manual actions. And it's also for consistency, right? As I build out my security operations playbooks to know that when this occurs, I have a three-step process I'm going to go through, and that it's going to happen that way every single time, because we're all still dealing with skill shortage and the problem of getting people trained and retained. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, that we're seeing in security operations that XDR also hopes to provide, is those consistent, reliable automations for improved efficiencies, reducing the attacker's dwell time, and providing those response actions in a more rapid behavior. So let's switch gears back to NOV for a minute, John. I want to get your perspective as an enterprise that has selected multiple best-of-breed technologies. Help us understand the way you're leveraging these two technology vendors that are on this call, both SentinelOne and Zscaler. How are you leveraging these technologies, and what are the outcomes you're currently achieving as a result?
Yeah, I'll address Zscaler first, because that was our first purchase that we had done years ago, and then I'll address SentinelOne. So years ago, we were facing a replacement of our web filtering product. We had on-prem legacy hardware, and we needed to, and it was a huge capital expense. And so we figured out we needed to look at something differently. And that's when we initially, our main use case was internet filtering with Zscaler. But really unbeknownst to us, and maybe Zscaler didn't market it write the earlier on to us, is one thing we realized was if the Zscaler connector was installed on a laptop and of course enabled, there is no way in the world, let's say like in the threat of ransomware, where it's going to want to call out. Zscaler just doesn't allow you to, or the worm, to ping another host or to scan. That's brilliant about their technology. Of course, we were looking at the internet filtering, which we have great stuff there. But on the same note, it was this thing that we really didn't expect. So now we stopped essentially lateral movement, let's say, of a worm, but we still have, like any large enterprise, we still have this legacy antivirus or the legacy EDR that we had. And so we definitely needed to replace that and upgrade that, because you're always going to have some sort of infection at an endpoint. And that's where SentinelOne comes into play. And so now I can safely say, as a security professional, by having SentinelOne and Zscaler on the same endpoint, I can sleep at night. I've got no problem. The problems that I have is on the other aspects of a large enterprise. And of course, SentinelOne has some capabilities there. They've got a Ranger product that can go and find some of this potential evil rogue devices in your network. And of course, Zscaler has some other technologies that you can put embedded into your network as well. So I guess what I'm getting at is, from an endpoint perspective, I think that the SentinelOne and the Zscaler on the endpoint is the best approach for any company today. It's great technology, and I sleep at night for those endpoints.
That's quite an endorsement, and I want to point out we're not paying you to say this. This is
No,
your personal experience. That's fantastic. Martin, let's talk a little bit about the product side of things. You and I can talk a little more detail about not only the things that John is currently appreciating from the partnership between us, but what's also coming down the road. Let's start with Zero Trust, right? And I'll have you spend a few minutes talking about some of the features that John talked about, but highlight the aspects that you think are most salient when it comes to better protection of cloud assets and conditional access.
Right. So I think there's a few things that we already do today, and as I said, there's a few things that we're also working on together. One thing I wanted to mention around Zero Trust, and it's kind of funny, John, that you said that. It's almost like the any deny rule is now a reality, right? That we failed to really implement in the firewall for the last 25 years. But what is interesting is also, from a Zero Trust perspective, is it also gives you a level of visibility that we didn't really have before, right? Because now it's really about the identity, because we can authenticate every single connection, every single transaction. We get reliable identity. We get visibility across egressing traffic and traffic to my private applications. It's pretty amazing, because all the data, of course, can be used within an XDR solution. But as we talk about Zero Trust and conditional access, so there's really two big areas that we are looking at, right? One is how can we use endpoint posture to drive more meaningful access control, specifically around, is an endpoint secure? Is this endpoint, protected? Does this endpoint follow my corporate policy? And then based on that, figure out what type of access do I want to give this endpoint to my private applications, which is what we do with our Zero Trust Exchange, with our platform, specifically with Zscaler Private Access, but then also expanding that to protecting your SaaS applications, because at the end of the day, your applications hold your data, and you want to make sure that a rogue endpoint or compromised endpoint, or an endpoint that simply doesn't follow your security best practices or requirements, cannot access these applications in the same way. And that's also something interesting that we do here on that front, because we believe that you have to go further than just allow and deny, because quite frankly, the end user experience is not going to be brilliant, if you will, to say the least. So you also will have some ability to then say, look, you can get access to this application from your own personal device, but perhaps in a way that is more sensible, I want to say, to protect the assets and the data that is processed by the application, for example, using an isolated browser session where we render the application experience back to the browser and make it still interactive, but making sure that no sensitive data can get down to like a potential rogue endpoint, or no malware can be put in like your SaaS applications for east-west lateral movement within SaaS applications. So we have like a lot of different ways to really slice and dice the policy and provide more controls simply based on what does the endpoint look like, how secure do we think the endpoint is, which really helps our conditional access policy and helps customers, again, driving better security outcomes without getting in the way of the end user, because that's another key point. That's actually one thing I also wanted to mention here, because I think, John, you also alluded to it, you have this one application and it allows you to do so many interesting things. User experience is absolute paramount. It's absolute key, because at the end of the day, like 25 years ago, when I started my career, we said, oh, users are stupid. Well, they aren't, right? They're just not security experts, let's face it. They're really smart in other areas. They're like, great at like, when it comes to legal questions or finance questions. So what I'm trying to say here is they don't necessarily know what we are all about with security, but if we get in the way of them doing their job, their business, they will try to find ways around our capabilities, and that's where we all lose together. So I think user experience in this whole concept is also paramount.
I think that's critical because we're always trying to provide a friction-free environment to ensure the proper level of security without hindering or impeding the business transactions that John has to do every day, right? We're never going to prevent people from making silly mistakes. And so that attack vector is always going to be there, whether that's an email-borne attack or a spear phishing or smishing from your phone. Like all of these things also expand the attack surface to start thinking about things like mobile devices, like Chromebooks, right, and all of the things there. Plus, with more and more cloud adoption, we're also seeing containerized security becoming a very important thing, and conditional access can also provide better containerization or segmentation for access to or from those assets. So that's important. Posture assessment you also mentioned, and that's an important part. The conditional controls that we put on endpoint, policies to determine what they're allowed and not allowed to do, should very much be informed by every bit of data we have about that user, that asset, that segment, and that network. Right. And if we don't have that much information and we treat everything the same, the only effective way of protecting it is to lock it down to a point that does provide friction. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. So understanding the posture of both the user, the asset, and the connection that's being made. Let's move on a little bit now to the second use case that I think is important, and it falls in line with the topic of the session today, and that's XDR. We know that the ability for us to leverage the technology that both that all vendors have in their best of breed architectures to allow for the best detection of threats from an email attack, from a firewall, from a web gateway, us from the endpoint, you from the cloud, getting all of that into a single location. I'm not going to go so far as to call XDR single pane of glass, because I think too many vendors have pitched this idea of single pane of glass, and it's really not what the reality looks like. But the singularity does have to be that data component. The architecture has to have access to, visibility, and actionability against all of the data that's relevant for that chain of events, or more importantly, for that behavioral activity from a user or an application. So it's more than just going beyond endpoint. It's really about going beyond traditional workflows and understanding that the adversaries, to your point earlier, Martin, they're already automating. They're building tooling and whatnot to make themselves faster and more efficient. The adversarial machine learning that's taking place on things like GANs and others are also elevating the risk considerably. The only way for us to get ahead of that is to have a better understanding, have a much larger scope on the data from all of the best in breed solutions that enterprises are adopting. And that really is the left side of the ingest path of XDR. And then, of course, the analytics in the middle yield better results, and those results are then pushed out the other side. So as we start looking at the way SentinelOne and Zscaler have moved in concert together to build better zero trust and XDR solutions, it really falls in two paths. One is effective, easy, simple ingestion of data, so that we have access to it for both detections and enrichment of incidents that we've detected on endpoints and beyond. Better analytics in the middle to make sure that we're enabling the analysts to perform better, quicker triage. And many of those steps are the automation piece, so data gathering, threat intelligence enrichment, all those things that we can bring to bear from a SOC analyst perspective. And then lastly, the response piece has to be automated or to some extent at least prescribed. Right. I think many vendors are saying that everything is done, within the blink of an eye and no user interaction whatsoever. Well, that's not always the right mode either, right? There's some risks involved in doing that. So I think there's a balance between automated response on those things that have to be done immediately, prescribed responses that still have some vetting from the analyst who's looking at the event flow and making sure that the response action is appropriate for the threat and the asset under question. And then also making sure that the visibility portion allows a SOC analyst to have access to every piece of data that's relevant for a given user or application transaction. So that's kind of our perspective on XDR. It takes the strength of an award-winning EDR platform, enriched with additional telemetry from all of your best-in-breed applications. And the way we're doing it with Zscaler, in fact, is interesting. The ZIA and the ZPA applications generate the telemetry, which we then consume natively. That data gets consumed without the requirement for building integration APIs or parsers. That's all done on our side through what we call Marketplace. Once that data is ingested, it's then made available alongside the EDR data for complex queries, analytics, and investigation. The response piece is quite simple, actually. It's all of the things that can be done from the Zscaler administrator's perspective, whether that's automatically pushing people into quarantine groups, whether that's forcing them through browser isolation, any of the things that you might choose to enforce on an end user's perspective, based on a series of events leading up to a detection or suspicion, can then be automated all the way through to the Zscaler product. Martin, you want to say anything about the way the two of us have worked together in terms of building both the ingest pipeline and the response pipeline?
So from an ingest pipeline, we essentially just send our logs directly to SentinelOne, and in those logs, for everybody who uses CIA specifically, or also CPA, how rich these logs are, how much visibility we really have. It's pretty amazing that when I first joined the company and looked at these logs, I'm like, this is essentially you take layer 2 and layer 3 information, a little bit of information away from a PCAP, and that's your log. So the level of visibility that we have is pretty serious, of course, and making that available to SentinelOne's XDR solution, of course, provides a lot of additional visibility. One thing I wanted to talk about as well on the response side is really using our APIs to then move users into different user groups, which then allows you to really apply any sort of different policy you want. As you know, user groups are the key, I want to say, to defining policy in CIA specifically, but also in CPA. So then being able to really have these fine-grained controls, as Mike already alluded to say not just I want to deny this access, but then also to say, look, I want to allow it, but use browser isolation to make sure that nothing bad can happen here. Or if you have some suspicion around some user activity, you can put the screws on a little bit more and use more file blocking and enforce a quarantine policy, for example, with our sandbox. There's multiple different ways to look at that and use that. But I also want to make sure that everybody understands this is just a starting point for a great partnership. There's a lot more that we want to do in the future, specifically from an API integration perspective, and how we can really, I think we can really drive conditional access, but then also the automation around detection and response to a great extent here. So I'm super excited about this partnership.
Great. So are we. And to your point earlier, I was shocked as well, pleasantly surprised at the amount of telemetry available inside your log stream, things we weren't expecting to be able to do to calculate volumetrics on things like the amount of data being sent to and from specific applications, and then baselining that over time, and then highlighting things like excessive data transfer. So these are all use cases that UEBAs used to do when analyzing specific data sets that we'll be able to actually incorporate into our technology going forward, given your data stream matched up with our analytics. So let's go to the next slide, and let's just see. So Martin, I think we've talked about most of these things at a very surface level. Maybe we've gone deeper on some of them. Anything else you want to talk about here with respect to either access control, visibility, or remediation?
I think today, as we really see the corporate environment from a technology perspective changing as much as we have seen over the last 2 years, I mean, it will continue, right? There was a forcing function called COVID, of course, right, that really forced us to work remotely. But I think one of the things that we have seen, like as not just as an industry, but also really as a society, is that it works, right? So I think working remotely is here to stay. And to that extent, what John already alluded to, like using a zero trust approach that not just simplifies the connectivity layer, but also gives you that level of control over who can access what, like, the identity portion, of course, and the application control portion. Those elements are simply critical to really provide security for this, distributed enterprise, almost, when I say, right, this new enterprise that we see. So universal access control, using like context and context around the endpoint is absolutely critical. The other bit I wanted to say on the visibility side, like, because all of that goes hand in hand, like you have users and applications not in your controlled environment anymore. So knowing what happens where, like what users are connecting to what application, what data is being exchanged is absolutely key for meaningful detection and response. And to that extent, right now, and I want to mention that we see over 220 billion transactions every day in our cloud. And one transaction is a client request and a server response. I always get asked, like, what do you guys mean by transactions? So there's the answer. That's what we mean: client request and server response. And every one of these transactions leads to one, in most cases, 2 or 3 logs. So that's just a massive amount of data that we have that we can provide, like in this partnership, to really give like unparalleled visibility for investigations, but also, like, Michael, to your point, to really provide a meaningful baseline for advanced analytics, like using machine learning. I don't want to use the term AI because that's a little bit of a, anyway. But yeah, to really train machine learning models to tell you, like, where are the anomalies, where's like anomalous behavior that requires further investigation. And then back to my earlier point, one-click remediation is absolutely key. Like if you have an event that you need to look at, and that's where the power of XDR really comes in. If you have an event you look at and you have to first manually figure out, is this something I care about? Is this real, first of all? Is this something I care about? And then figure out what are the right responses that I could potentially kick off, and maybe with filing a ticket somewhere. That's a losing proposition. You're up against software, you're up against automation. Your response requires automation. So the one-click remediation capability that we have in this partnership is absolutely key.
To listen to numbers like over 200 billion events, and transactions processed each day, we just crossed the 1.5 trillion mark not too long ago, from all of our endpoint data and assets, as well as our mobile and container solutions. So when you hit numbers like that, you really appreciate the scale and the reason that vendors like us that have moved to cloud first architectures is because there's no possible way we could have scaled our infrastructure in an on-prem environment to be able to handle that, not alone the level of multi-tenancy required to do that out of a cloud SaaS application. So dealing with that much data is challenging. We actually acquired an entire technology stack and company last year to solve that data problem for us in the back end, and we've already migrated customers to it. We're seeing a 5x performance improvement in query speed, and that means we can also do net new detections at a faster pace. We can do responses much quicker and more accurately. So John, let's shift back to you for a minute and end on this before we open it up to the Q&A of the registrants. How do you expect going forward to leverage the technologies? You've given us a great endorsement for what we've already done with you and for you up until now, but hearing Martin and I speak about where we're going and the opportunities in front of us, where do you think the intersect point looks like for NOV, and how do we transact better with customers like yourself?
Well, obviously, the cybersecurity journey is never done. It's just a continuous journey. I think that we can pivot on our roads to help tailor to our enterprises. That pivot for us was zero trust. I think I lost everybody.
Oh, we can hear you.
So, oh, you can hear?
Yes, you're cutting out a little bit, and now we might have just lost John. That is unfortunate. Let's give him a moment to see if he can come back and rejoin us. Martin, while we're waiting, as you look at other best-in-breed integrations, I mentioned identity earlier as one of the key tenets of SentinelOne going forward is to build better integrations with and support for identity technologies. More importantly, as we look at how identity meets the enterprise meets cloud, I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can do together. That only generates more data, but also more opportunity for us to build better interactions for our customers. What other integrations do you think you're seeing your customers build that lend itself to both zero trust and or the XDR messaging going forward?
Yeah, I think one thing that we really need to think about is, we have endpoint covered pretty well. Of course, we're covering identity. We're covering like the applications and access to those applications. But I think one thing that might be something to think about, like, for us as an industry, is also how does all of this potentially include, elements like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, right? Because ultimately, if the data center moves out of the data center, like out of the physical building, and moves into some different form factors, that is really the next frontier to figure out how can we actually extend that level of visibility and control to the data center. We have to this new data center. We have made some significant investments on that front, but I think that's also the next frontier for us as an industry to really take a hard look at, to see how can we drive meaningful customer value in a I want to say best of breed platform approach there.
That's great. Zero Trust has the added advantage of being front of mind and top of conversation based on the executive order that was issued, and so it got a lot of attention from a lot of organizations and standards bodies. XDR is still a bit soft in that area in terms of having clear definitions, clear actionable goals. I think everyone's got slightly different approaches, and many vendors are approaching it from their positions of strength, right? So if you're a firewall vendor, you think XDR starts with a big firewall technology, and if you're endpoint like us, you think it's endpoint driven. I think that the customers will determine what are the key use cases that will drive XDR adoption. I think it's safe to say that extending detection and response beyond the endpoint is a given. I think it's safe to say that better analytics over time will yield a better security posture if we can do the detections correctly and effectively. And I think a theme that's been heard a couple times across this session, speed, right? The velocity with which we can take these detections and turn them into policy enforcements, changing user behavior through technology a little bit, or at least guiding them down the path of making better, smarter decisions. And when we can't, allowing us to automate where we can to increase the velocity of our SOC responses. John, welcome back. We were just chatting about you while you were gone.
Apparently, I'm the victim of the cyber attacks that are going on right now. I guess that's what it is. I had a complete power outage.
I hope everything's fine. So back to the question at hand. What do you think going forward your engagement looks like with vendors like SentinelOne and Zscaler? What are your perspectives on what we've talked about today, and where do you think going forward NOV and vendors should be engaging to align to those outcomes?
Yeah, obviously that cybersecurity journey is never going to end, and it's going to be this long path. But I've got certain key goals that I want to hit. One is kill the VPN. One is kill the password. It's all kind of during that zero trust journey. But I also have another one, and it's kind of a big, hairy, audacious goal, and that is kill the Windows domain. I think that with COVID kind of proved to us, do we really need to log in to this domain that we did in the past? And I think that, again, I can only speak for my company, but with key investments in certain technologies like Okta and Zscaler and SentinelOne, I really think that we can get there. But then also with SentinelOne and with Zscaler, we can create some conditional access policies that if you did need to go into a smaller version of that Windows domain, maybe there's some conditions that we have to meet before we allow you to do that. Anyways, we're still, I'm thinking way in the future on that one.
That's good to hear, and it gives us plenty of opportunities to work together going forward. Clearly, you're building your technology stack with best of breed, and we're here to help you with that journey as well. Thank you again for the questions. Thank you for the candid responses. Jeremy, I'm gonna ask you to come back off mute and let us know, are there any questions from the attendees that the audience would like to pose to either of these three panelists?
There was one question I definitely want to pick up real quick, if you guys don't mind. So there was a question around like, I have to apologize. I used a couple of acronyms that are like Zscaler specific with CIA and CPA and so forth. So really quick for the audience, Zscaler Internet Access is, think of it as like that's how we actually started. This is really our prevention and protection type of layer as you egress to the internet, really secures access to the internet, protects the end user, protects like the use of SaaS applications in your data. And ZPA is the product that John kind of alluded to that really kills the VPN, because that really is that product that provides users access to your private applications in a very zero trust way through our proxy infrastructure. I always like to say it, to some extent, like from this experience, it cloudifies your private applications. So those are the two main products. I apologize that I just used those acronyms without explaining what those really are.
Great. I know people hate when we throw acronyms around without giving explanation. So thanks for clarifying that. Jeremy, anything else from the audience?
Yes, we do have a question. I get dozens of clients asking for a handful of key benefits of XDR versus MDR. Although I understand some of the key differences and can explain, what would you say are some differences that XDR benefits that most organizations can realize for the small to large organization sizes?
So I'm gonna group. I'll take a first stab at that. I'm gonna group MDR into the same pseudo categories MSSP. Now, they're not exactly the same, but I'm going to say that if you're subscribing to a service that's delivering you based on SLAs and outcomes, right? It's either just specifically managed detection and response, which is the MDR side, or you're asking an entire services organization to provide you outcomes that you're paying for, in an OpEx way. I think the important thing is understanding that there's a merge going on between MDR and XDR, and you're going to see MXDR at some point. It's that, in fact, many MSSPs I would claim are probably already offering you the experience of XDR. That is, they're taking in the telemetry, they're using their own bespoke tooling and analytics, and then they're delivering very specific outcomes that you don't have to staff for. And the advantage is that you're not having to spend your precious resources hiring teams of full stack developers to do things that you're not perfectly suited to do, right? You're an organization offering healthcare or insurance or energy, right? So it's not your number one goal to have to know everything about the security stack that is providing you protection. So I think XDR is going to have a place in each of these areas. I think it's safe to say that the MDR/MSSPs are probably already delivering some of that with their own tooling. So I think the target audience for an effective XDR, at least in the early stages, might be the mid enterprise to low end that need a little more out of the box functionality without a lot of hand holding, without a lot of coding. I've heard people explain it to me as the easy button of SIM/SOAR. I don't agree with that terminology, but I understand where they're coming from. They're looking for a simpler way to do what those technologies did without the burden of cost and resources that are typically associated with standing up those platforms of SIM and SOAR. XDR is going to deliver that at a much lower price point with much better integrations without having to build bespoke platforms or rule sets. I hope that answered the question. What else is the audience asking?
Yeah, so this is probably more of a question for Martin. Is Zscaler ZPA a web proxy? And does both SentinelOne and the Zscaler agent have to be installed on the endpoint for that conditional access use case that we talked about earlier?
The answer is sort of and yes. So it's not a web proxy per se, it's a proxy, right? So we do have web proxying capabilities, of course, and we extend our proxying platform to ZPA as well, which is in some sense, it's super cool because ultimately what happens is if a user tries to talk to an internal application, to a private application, that user or that endpoint establishes a connection to our proxy first, and then that proxy for that session makes a decision based on identity and access policy on how to connect you to that application. It's cool because the endpoint has no knowledge of the internal IP layout of the network because it really just talks to our proxy, and that proxy brokers that connection. And yes, you need to have both endpoint product installed. SentinelOne and Zscaler. Zscaler, of course, Zscaler client connector to provide the connectivity. And then, of course, we want to look at the endpoint to see if that endpoint is secure. And if SentinelOne is running on that endpoint, it's secure from our perspective.
In fact, one of the first use cases we built for the zero trust scenario is that our system will actually check for the existence of the Zscaler will check for the existence of the SentinelOne agent, and if it's not installed, it will automatically force that user into a conditional group, providing reduced access until such time as they've installed or updated the SentinelOne agent. So that's the reason why both agents are required, and more importantly, how one agent informs on another one to improve security posture.
Okay, and we have another question in here, mainly around the relationship between XDR and the SIM. So does SentinelOne share endpoint data unilaterally with both Zscaler and SIMs, or does it also use data from SIMs to help enforce those policies?
That's a great point. It's not up to us. Like we understand completely that we are not the center of the universe, right? Any one vendor who says they are or they need to be is simply misleading the customer. I think there's a good understanding that data needs to be shared. In fact, I'm a firm believer in the democratization of your customer data. The telemetry should be collected once, stored in one location, used by multiple applications, and never held hostage. That's in a perfect world, right? You might have one central data lake of data that all of your tooling will talk to. The reality is that at least in the early stages, that data is being replicated or bifurcated. So the data that's coming out of any telemetry source, whether that's an endpoint technology stack like SentinelOne's EDR, whether that is the SentinelOne agent and all of the cloud telemetry that's being gathered, or it's third-party telemetry is being generated by other best-in-breed sources, they need to be accessible by multiple applications today. So for us, the data flow looks like this: data that's being collected by the endpoint from the SentinelOne EDR agent goes into our cloud workload or our cloud data lake. The data from the Scaler agent gets generated from their platform and can hit a distribution point where it can be forwarded both to a SIM and or to SentinelOne. And we also have a technology that allows us to take data out of our data lake and forward it on to a legacy SIM or additional log platform. So we call that Cloud Funnel. It allows you to take our data, filter what you need, and push it over to a secondary platform. The advantage is that some SIMs, as you know, are consumption-based, which means the more you consume, the more you pay. And if you want to trim down what goes into those, you might want to do some pre-filtering and make sure you're only sending to your SIM that which is relevant for both detection and or compliance, and not a lot of the useful logs that may be generated by telemetry sources. So yes, the answer is we work hand in hand with SIMs. We can feed data from our platforms into SIMs. And we can also then take action within SIM platforms as well. SIMs can also generate alerts that can then be forwarded to us, and we can consume those as well. So we have full bidirectional event handling for both SIM and EDR.
There's one question I want to take on because that's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So the question is if Zscaler and SentinelOne will be using one single console, and when will this be available for the public? So the answer is likely not. But the interesting thing here is that the cloud has many great opportunities for all of us, right? So from a vendor perspective, one of the things that is amazing about cloud technology is, of course, that everything is built on APIs. So it provides a great opportunity to have two consoles work, together, share information, kick off workflows. So you don't have to manually go from one console to the other one to do essentially the same thing that you could automate via an API. So not necessarily like one console, but you should be able to drive the outcomes you're looking for from a single console. Let's put it that way.
I think the important thing there too is there are certain things that the Zscaler console will be used for exclusively for policy configuration, enforcement, all of those things. But absolutely, the transaction, the actions that need to be taken from a protection or a remediation perspective are, as Martin mentioned, all API driven. So from the user's perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's pushed from our platform or it's pushed from a third-party solution. Even SOAR tools can do these types of things. So it's important that at least the transaction can be exercised and enforced through data pathing and workflows. It's not important that they be one common application interface, because the administration side of things versus the response side of things are normally the purview of two separate personas anyway. Jeremy, anything else?
Yeah, we just have one question in relation to the conditional access use case. So if Zscaler is checking for the presence of SentinelOne, does it check for a particular version, or does it just check that SentinelOne is running and exists on the endpoint?
So it is only checking, in air quotes, only checking if it's there and running, because presumably if it's there and running, then everything else is taken care of by the SentinelOne platform in that sense, like what version should be running, what updates, I would assume, right? So Michael, I'll let you expand on that, but we just check like, is it on there, is it running, and then is it running the right way is something that the SentinelOne solves for you.
It's a really good point. I used to use an analogy of an equalizer, right? And I show a picture of this hi-fi equalizer. It's this thing about this big. It's got about 18 knobs on it. And I asked people who recognize this device. And if you said equalizer, I'd give you credit. If you said hi-fi equalizer, I knew how old you are and what generation you came from. But at the end of the day, the reason that those things were used was to fine-tune the policy of the way audio was experienced for very specific use cases. So you might have a certain set of dial settings for opera, and another separate one for rock and roll, and a third one for jazz, right? The goal of a good vendor user experience is to help you understand, without having to know the details of what all those dials do, help you dial in exactly the settings you need for the use case that's appropriate for that environment. So what I can say is that the interaction between the user and the console and the end user technology stack, whether that's the Zscaler policy on the agent or ours, is really guided by the best user experience. And that is, in keeping with our goal of making friction-free or frictionless security for the end user, and more importantly, making sure as well that we can maintain these styles of integrations going forward across a very broad ecosystem of partners. You'll see more and more about that, both with Zscaler and SentinelOne going forward with additional integrations and more outcome-based use cases. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I think we're probably at the end of our session. Let's go to the next slide and make sure that if anybody has questions, they know where to reach out. Obviously, if you would like a demo of the SentinelOne technology stack with the Zscaler integration, please feel free to reach out to this URL to get a demo. And of course, we also have our solution brief published at the lower URL as well. Martin, if you'd like to make any final comments, or John, please feel free. If not, I want to thank everyone who attended, and also Martin and John for co-presenting with me on this session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.